lecture, so don't leave, okay? That we will take a big picture before you're leaving, okay? So, okay, let's start. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Asif Ghazanfar. Asif is a professor of neuroscience and psychology and associate faculty member in ecology, evolutionary biology at Princeton University. Born in Washington State and raised in Idaho.
This is going to be a long introduction.
He earned a philosophy degree from University of Idaho before completing his PhD in neurobiology at Duke University under Miguel Nicolelis. He later pursued postdoctoral work at Harvard University with Mark Hauser and at the Max Planck Institute in Germany with Nikos Logothetis. His research focused on the biology of vocal communication in primates, with a particular interest in understanding the developmental principles behind primate vocal behavior through an integrative approach, in which he combines unique experimental designs, neurophysiology studies, and computational modeling. Asif received several awards in recognition for his scientific works, which include NSF Career Award, James McDonald Scholar Award, and Troland Research Award. It's important to say that in his spare time, Asif pursued his career as a virtuoso rock guitarist. One more personal note, Asif has been my mentor for a long time, at least for 15 years now, and it was one of my dreams to have Asif come to give a talk in Brazil. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Asif.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. I mean, it's funny that you refer to me as your mentor. I kind of think of it as the opposite on most occasions. And this talk will reveal why I think so. Okay. So as Daniel mentioned, I'm primarily a biologist, and more recently have begun making forays back to being somewhat of a poor philosopher, poor man's philosopher. So this talk is going to be a very high-level biology talk, and what I hope you guys do is engage with me throughout the talk. So I've kind of roughly in mind that I have 45 slides for my first hour, then we take a break, and then I have 45 slides for the next hour, but I don't care whether we get to all of those slides. It'd be much more meaningful if you guys just interrupt me if you have a question or something you're curious about, and then we'll engage that way, and then we'll take it from there, okay? Again, it does not matter. I'm not trying to there's no complete story in biology, so I'm not trying to tell a complete story. Let's just kind of have fun with some of these ideas. So I'm going to talk about the life of behavior, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And then I'm going to kind of illustrate what I mean by that through work done on marmoset monkeys and their vocal behavior over the course of many, many years. Okay, and this is work I started with Daniel. Okay, let's see. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is that we're trying to create a departure from what I would call, and maybe someone would disagree with me, kind of the normal scientific way of thinking about how the brain and behavior work. So this is, I feel, this is a kind of a cartoon version of the standard way. So the brain is a computer that's kind of operating in a vat. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the brain is operating independent of what the body is. I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah, probably. We share the screen. Yeah, it's working now. And then maybe the second. Eu não sei o que aconteceu, saiu aqui. Okay, everyone, so just to, I think Asif already told you, but different from the other talks that we have, please just interrupt, just raise the hand during the talk, okay? So I will give the microphone. Yeah.
What I mean by that is, a lot of times if you go to a neuroscience lab, they're studying neurophysiology in the brain and everything's, I mean, and I used to do this too, but you would think of it as, oh, here's this brain operating kind of independently of what the animal actually is, the shape of its body or what it's intended to do. You were just kind of, the animal was there in a sense to just keep the brain alive for you to do your experiments. And then there's another kind of prevailing way of thinking about the brain is that it's a sensory motor transformation, that we perceive, we sense something, I touch this, and then that sensory information goes to my brain, and then I have to decide what my next action is. And this kind of idea comes from the first principal neural circuit that anyone ever learns, which is the reflex circuit. You touch something, you know, you hit your knee, it gets a sensory information, your muscle gets activated, and that idea of a reflex circuit just expanded almost into all of cognition, for all the way, you know, to conditioned responses are a kind of reflex arc as well. And then, and this is what we'll get to towards the end if we make it there, is that when we think of variability in our experiments, we think of that something, oh, we're trying to get rid of the variability, right? We're trying to create an average with small error bars, and then we can make a strong claim. But I would argue that the variability, all the interesting things about biology are in the variability. In fact, the whole theory of evolution is based on variability. So what I hope to do throughout this set of presentations is to, instead of this kind of life-independent way of thinking about the biology of behavior, I want to put it in the context of a living organism, and that's going to be the marmoset monkey, right? So we're going to talk about how the brain has a body, and this body is operating in a world. The behavior is, instead of an arc, that it's a loop, that behavior is always something that is ongoing. And then I'm not sure if we'll get to this controversial part that I think Ahmed will take issue with. The question of whether behavior has a purpose or not, we may skip. And then we'll go back to talking about variability, particularly in the context of development and evolution, and how this variability is really how individuals are made. Okay, so that more complicated slide, I'm going to reduce to this slide that I repeated, which is, as I'm focusing on communication, I'm going to refer to communication as an emergent property of the body, context, and the brain, with each of these not playing a more or less important role. And then I'm going to talk about this interaction in real time, in developmental time, and in evolutionary time. Yeah, Manuel.
Let me ask the first introductory question. Do you see yourself as a cyberneticist?
I'm familiar with cybernetics. I did a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute of Biological Cybernetics. But I really feel like that's not where my perspective kind of came out of in that
Just
particular.
the terminology seems to have a similar vibe. The brain as organized
Yeah,
control
I
loops,
wouldn't
the
deny
theological
being a
domain.
cyberneticist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to go through examples and multiple studies that show this interaction, and we're going to do it through, okay, we're going to start with the real-time behavior, and then we're going to look at, well, how does this behavior kind of emerge over development, and then we're going to ask, well, how does this developmental process emerge in an evolutionary process, a longer time scale? And the animal that we're going to use is the marmoset monkey, and I'll tell you more about this particular primate. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge that this work is done in a network of collaborators. And usually, like what people, in fact, what I used to do is like, you'd say, okay, well, here are the postdocs, here are the graduate students, and you create kind of a hierarchy of the people that are working with you. I feel like in this work, I've learned as much from everyone that I've worked with as they may have learned from me. And so the only hierarchy that I would say exists is with Daniel being and Yisi being more of a stronger hub of ideas in the lab. So Daniel I've been working with for, I don't know, 15 years now. Yisi is a longtime collaborator as well, who's now at Tsinghua University in China. And then you'll see familiar names like Hanada and Chiago. And then throughout the talk, you'll see where it's relevant, the different names come up. Importantly, and as far as like intellectual challenges and things that kind of drive my philosophical approach, some people that I fight with are Ahmed, who's in the back over there, and my colleague in Spain who I've written with, Alex Gomez Marin. All right, so let's get on to the good stuff. So I'm going to tell you the story about marmoset monkeys, and here are the starting assumptions prior to that work. So one starting assumption is that, big brains are necessary for cooperative communication in animals. So communication like you would have like at a conversation over coffee. Number two, that the body's not involved in behavioral control, is the passive recipient of neural commands. And three, aside from humans, mammalian vocalizations don't develop, you're just born with them, and that they are experience independent. Okay, these were the starting assumptions when we kind of embarked on this program with marmoset research. And you know, it's fair to say, like, we didn't say, look, here are some starting assumptions, and now we're going to prove them wrong with marmoset research. We started doing the research, and then these assumptions that were already in the literature became apparent to us and that we could address them. Okay, so let's start off with conversations that we have, that you will have after. This is not a normal conversation with me talking and you staring at me. A normal conversation is something you would have over dinner or with your spouse or with your friend, where it's a cooperative exchange, where you say something, then somebody else will respond, and you generally don't talk in an overlapping way, otherwise you wouldn't be able to hear what the other person is saying. So there's something a little bit universal about conversations. Of course, there's some variability in there, but usually you say, look, you try not to overlap with somebody, and that there's a little bit of a temporal gap between what one person says and what the other person says. So that was typically a friendly conversation. Of course, if you're angry with each other, then you might be overlapping and a little bit more aggressive. So let's think of this as polite conversational rules. And normally, if I wanted to ask this question, look, there's lots of humans that do this. This may be something universal to all humans, independent of culture. And when you have a behavior like that, that's human and universal, then you can start asking the question, well, if it's if it's a behavior that's universal to human, maybe there's some evolutionary origin for it. And if you think about an evolutionary origin of a behavior, there's no way you can look at the fossil records, because the fossil records don't tell you anything about behavior, okay? So what you have to do is you have to look at, here are the existing animals right now on Earth, and I'm going to try to make a comparison of what those animals do to see if there's anything like turn-taking in those animals, okay? And if there is, then we can say, okay, well, the origin of turn-taking was then from a common ancestor to that animal in humans. So normally, if let's say we're taking vocal turn-taking in this case, normally you say, okay, well, humans are over here, we do turn-taking, and if I'm trying to understand the evolutionary origins, let's look at some closely related species that's still alive today. Let's look at the chimpanzees, okay? And if you look at chimpanzees and you ask, well, do they have anything like turn-taking? The answer is pretty disappointing, okay? So relative to humans, chimpanzees don't seem to use vocalizations all that much. Chimps don't exchange vocalization in that turn-taking way that we do. They do produce a lot of manual gestures without vocalizations, and this has led to people coming up with hypotheses about the origins of our communications through gestural communication, like moving your hands, instead of through the voice. But I really think this is just, these are individuals that are just trying to save chimpanzees as a model for understanding human communication, particularly vocal communication, and I think in general it fails to do that. Okay, so if that's not going to work, why don't we go in a different part of the evolutionary tree where there's some evidence of vocal exchanges. And that brings us to the marmoset monkey. Okay, so the marmoset monkeys are a really small monkey. They're probably, an adult probably stands about this tall. They're native to northeastern Brazil. Like humans, this is a really kind of important part of marmoset monkey behaviors. Like humans, they have a cooperative breeding strategy. And what that means is, unlike most other primate species and unlike most other mammals, both parents will take care of any offspring, and even older offspring will help take care of younger offspring, and even other group members will help take care of the babies. So humans do that, of course, we all know that humans do that, but marmosets also do that, and that makes humans and marmosets kind of exceptional among primates. And this cooperative breeding will become an important feature for a lot of the explanations that we have. So one of the cool things about cooperative breeding is that it lends to this species being more pro-social. Pro-social is just a fancy way of saying that they're more friendly with each other. So this is a kind of a summary. It's not real data. It's kind of a summary of many studies that's saying the strength of prosociality on this axis, and you can think of strength as like, you can measure it by like how often will they share food with another individual. Okay, and so strength of prosociality on this axis, and then how closely related you are on this axis. And you can see that for marmosets and humans, the diamonds and the squares up here, they're much more prosocial than, let's say, another South American monkey called the capuchins, and chimpanzees, which are not prosocial at all. Okay? Yes?
What is anonymous group members?
Anonymous, so if you take, that's a good question. So anonymous group members will be like from an adjacent, like a group that you're familiar with, but that's adjacent to you, perhaps in another territory. So you may know their vocalizations, you may know them by sight, but not really interact with them on a day-to-day basis. Thank you. Okay, another interesting feature about marmosets is that they have all this cooperative breeding and prosociality, but as a model for understanding processes, they also develop 12 times faster than humans, and that's great if you want to do developmental studies. So for every year of a human, it's a month for marmosets, so it's a very fast processes. And the behavior that we want to focus on is all displayed right here. So this very simple behavior has layers and layers of complexity that generate it. Okay, so what you're looking at here is a representation of sound. So this is the sound amplitude waveform, and this is a spectrogram. So everyone knows what a spectrogram is, frequency over time. So you're looking at basically a picture of the sound. So the blue is one marmoset producing a contact call, and if another marmoset hears that contact call, that marmoset will produce a reply to the contact call, and then the first marmoset may or may not respond to that reply. The red is much bigger because the microphone is closer to that marmoset. And then here we have basically the spectrographic representation. So another kind of difference between marmosets and, let's say, chimpanzees is that they're a very vocal species. They produce a lot of vocalizations, and they produce these vocalizations quite frequently, and that just may be partly because they're in this dense rainforest environment. They're very small, so they're hard to see, and so evolution has kind of guided them to produce more vocalizations for communication. And so we can make an experiment to kind of get around this idea of a reflex arc or a sensory motor transformation by showing that what the marmosets do is they don't, one marmoset doesn't produce a call and then the other marmoset senses and then responds, and then that's it. We can show that they go back and forth in these exchanges. And so we had a setup where in an experimental room, we could put one marmoset in one corner, another marmoset in the other corner, and then we just divide the room with a acoustically transparent but visually opaque occluder. And we can show that these marmosets start producing calls every 5 to 10 seconds or so. And when they produce those calls, they don't overlap. They are very, very polite communicators. So one marmoset will call, there'll be a break. The other marmoset will call, there'll be a break. And they keep doing this over and over again like we would do. And then kind of two things we can show is that the two marmosets, when they keep exchanging these calls over time, they basically become phase-locked with each other. And the other kind of important thing that we can show is that they can kind of adjust the timing of their vocalizations a little bit. So for example, if you're talking to somebody who speaks fast, you'll have a tendency to start speaking a little bit faster as well. If they slow down, you'll slow down as well. And what this plot is showing is that the marmoset's response time adjusts according to how quickly the other marmoset is responding. We can also show, so that's showing, okay, well now that's not really a sensory motor arc, that's a sensory motor loop. We can also show that this communication is very context dependent. And this is experiments done by Diana Liao and Yisi, where we have the exact same setup, but now we can have the marmoset, and there's 4 different conditions. You can have the marmoset alone, and when the marmoset alone, it's trying to make contact with someone else, and so it'll spontaneously produce vocalizations. And then you can have the condition that we call the occluded FAR, which is the same condition as the previous experiment. And then what we can do is we can just start changing that experiment. So now instead of being occluded, the marmosets can see each other, and now instead of just seeing each other from far away, we put them next to each other but in separate cages so that they can see and hear each other, but they can't touch each other. And then we just ask the question, well, how does their vocal behavior change? Okay, and so this is a very complicated slide, so let me walk you through the relevant parts. So these are just the conditions again, and these are just various acoustic measurements we made of the vocalizations that are produced in these different conditions. So we can measure the frequency, we can measure the dominant frequency, the amplitude, etc. We can measure the amount of time spent calling, and already you see a difference. So when they're alone, they call a lot, and by the time they're close to each other, perhaps the need to call is no longer there, and so they don't call as much. And then if you just track the different acoustic variables, you can see that depending on context, they change. The duration changes, the frequency changes, the amplitude changes, the entropy, which is just a measure of noisiness, also changes, so the calls get slightly more spectrally complex as the animals get closer to each other. So now we have the sensory motor loop. As we change the context, the behavior of the animal is also changing quite a bit. And this is not terribly important, so I'll skip that slide. So what we can conclude at this stage is that you can have vocal turn taking, which is previously thought to be some higher order cognitive ability. You can have vocal ticket with the big brain like we do, but you could also have with a very small brain and with no manual gestures or anything like that in the marmoset monkey. Okay, so what I want to conclude, you're going to see this slide over and over again, but what I think we conclude here is that, look, we have a context with a brain that's operating, that's producing these different vocalizations. These different vocalizations will change as you just change something very simple, which is just a physical distance between two individuals. And we're getting a sense of, well, how communication emerges in real time. Does anyone have any questions up until this point? Yeah.
So you mentioned that one of your 3 assumptions, so the third one is that
It's experience dependent.
It's experience independent, but now you show some examples where actually they do change their vocal sounds depending on whether there's another marmoset available or not. Do these 2 things conflict with each other? I don't know. It's
So the 3 assumptions were assumptions other people made,
okay.
not necessarily our assumptions.
Okay. Okay.
And that
okay.
and that third part where we talk about, where I'm referring to, are the vocalizations experience independent or experience dependent? I'm going to show you a whole developmental story that addresses that. Okay? Are there any other questions? Okay. Okay, so let's move to development. And I think when we talk about behavioral development, usually what we think of is like, okay, well, if we see a behavioral change, that must be entirely due to a change in the brain. Something is learned, or there's a process, developmental process that's come online, and that is what accounts for the behavioral change. But there are kind of 2 ways to look at development. There's synchronic viewpoint, which is what are all the things that are changing at a particular time? And then there's kind of the normal way of thinking about development, which is diachronic, what is happening, what is the change that's happening over time. So there's simultaneous change, and then there's change over time, and you'll see that we're going to investigate both. Okay, so we're going to move now to talking about, well, how do these vocalizations develop? And kind of our most familiar framework is thinking about it in terms of humans, where, even in the womb, we have different facial expressions. The very first thing that a healthy infant does when it emerges from the womb is to start producing cries. And those cries immediately start eliciting a contingent response from caregivers. Okay, so you start crying, the caregiver tries to soothe you, or you get fed, or you get picked up. And that forms the basis, eventually, of having a meaningful conversation with your offspring, and ultimately taking those skills and having conversations with anybody. And this entire process depends on these kind of synchronic interactions, okay? So you have cries, so the kind of the linear way of thinking about development, or the change over time, is you go from cries to fussing sounds, to something called protophones, to babbling, which is just the beginnings of speech, so ba, 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 da, da, da. And these are all kind of the outcome of growth processes and contingent caregiver feedback. And this basically, this feedback basically exploits our tendencies towards conversation. And so the synchronic processes are kind of illustrated here, where there's many things happening at the same time during your development, right? Your vocal tract, the shape of your head, and the internal anatomy that's changing your sounds, that's changing shape. Those things are controlled. Your tongue, the opening and closing of your jaws are controlled by muscles, which are also changing. The inputs to those muscles are from a brain that's also changing, and this brain is not only changing from feedback that's coming from those internal sources, but also from feedback that's coming from external sources. So there's many things happening at once. And so you can think about it like, okay, well, that's like obvious. The way I think about it is all those things, if I'm trying to understand where behavior comes from, all those things are super important for trying to understand that, not just the brain. And so what we've done over many years is try to take this whole framework and apply it to the development of those monkey communication calls, okay? Why is the work important? Because a little bit like the cooperative communication, people for many, many decades would say, look, when it comes to monkey calls, there actually is no development of monkey calls. That when they're born, they produce all the sounds that sound like adult calls. But there's no process. They call this innate, okay? The result of some sort of automatic program, okay? So what these authors wrote many years ago, and many people actually still believe, they say, the importance of auditory feedback in the development of spoken language in humans is striking. That is, when we learn how to speak, even from the very beginning, we're using inputs from our caregivers or other people to help guide our speech patterns. There's little evidence that our nearest relatives, the non-human primates, require auditory feedback for the development of species-typical vocalizations. So they're saying basically, look, it's just automatic. And this is studies based on squirrel monkeys and based on macaque monkeys that they reach this conclusion. Yes?
Hi, I'm seeing that we are using in this slide the word language for humans, but thus far we haven't called vocalization a type of language. Do you think it is a type of language, or we couldn't call it language in other primates or animals?
So that's a good question. So the question is whether or not monkey vocalizations or any animal vocalizations, whether or not marmoset vocalizations, are there anything, is it like language? The quote uses language, which is not what that's not the word I would use. I would have said speech. So what is the distinction between speech and language? Speech is just as a auditory mode of communication, whereas language is a system of rules that it could be written language, it could be sign language, it could be speech language. I hope this is not controversial. I don't think any other animal has anything like language. Okay? Yep.
But they do have like typical vocal properties, right? So these calls have some duration, they have some frequencies, and if that's different, then everything changes, right?
Yeah. So I think if you take the development of a speech signal, I think you could take the marmoset vocalization that I'll talk about as kind of their equivalent of a speech signal, but they don't combine their vocalizations to mean. In fact, it's unclear what even a marmoset vocalization means, and we can talk about that. But they certainly don't say, I'm going to take vocalization A and B, and that means C, and if I put B in front of A, that means D. They don't have anything like that.
But you can call it proto-language, right, or no?
I think even proto-languages is going too far.
I would argue that language, especially for linguists, is something quite specific. That's you got to have symbols that are not related to the object we're referring to, and these symbols need to be socially determined, not something innate. So language is something quite specific. It's not only communication. What you're talking about is communication. Language is more abstract than that. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to define it. Anything else? Yeah, Manuel.
Maybe you could say a word or two about species outside of the primates, because bird songs can learn their vocalizations quite effectively from teachers. Is this completely independent? Because there are other examples in the animal kingdom too where these phenomena exist.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So what Manuel's bringing up, what I'm pointing out is when it comes to primate vocalizations, humans, people would just say humans are exceptional because we're the only primate that has to learn how to produce the sounds that we produce. Okay, and that's based on lots of work that people have done on basically 2 different species, and they say, okay, well look, in these species, they're born, they produce the sounds, and the sounds don't change. Okay? Manuel's pointing out, well, there's other animals, particularly songbirds, that lots and lots of them have to learn how to produce their song. Depending on the species, how they may learn that song can vary. In some species, the mechanism that I'm going to show you for marmosets and humans, they adopt that similar mechanism. The question you asked additionally, well, why is it that something like a songbird is able to learn how to produce their song? That's how do they adopt this kind of widespread learning capacity? That's a question I don't really know. What's interesting, though, is that all songbirds have a special organ that's just for producing their vocalizations and their song, whereas primates like us and like marmoset monkeys have to share one organ, which is the larynx, that has to be there for producing sounds and for producing respiratory power for different movements and for making sure that its control has to make certain that we don't swallow something wrong that goes in the wrong airway. So we're using to produce all our complicated sounds a larynx that has multiple functions, whereas the birds get this independent organ called the syrinx that can be dedicated only to producing sounds. So that may be one of the limitations. Okay, so let's see if we can address this question with marmosets. Is it actually true what they're saying? And the first thing that we noticed, the first thing that we did is we took it very seriously. And what I mean by that is we had a colony of monkeys, and we knew that they developed really fast, so that we knew that if we're going to measure things over time, we have to measure them densely. So every day or every other day, we would take an infant out and we would measure its vocal output. Okay, and we did this for a month or 2, and what we saw is that from their first vocalizations to their vocalizations a month later, there were dramatic differences, which means they were changing developmentally, which means it's completely in contrast to what people were saying about other monkeys. So here's what I can show you. This is from one marmoset at his first day of postnatal life, so the day after being born, 2 weeks later, and then a month later. And you're looking at a spectrogram of about 30 seconds of just producing vocalizations. By itself, it's just producing vocalizations. And what you can see immediately is that on that first day, those vocalizations are very noisy and diverse. So you have these noisy kind of cry-like calls, and then you have interspersed with something that seems a little more structured than the cry-like calls. And then 2 weeks later, you're getting a little more structure and a fewer of those cry-like calls. And then by 30 days old, you're only getting these contact calls, the same contact calls that they used in their turn taking. Okay? And it's important to note that these are all recorded in the exact same context. The animal is by itself briefly, and there's no other marmosets around within hearing distance. Okay? So already we have something that's dramatically different than what people have reported for other primates. And if we break down the changes, this is what we see. We have calls that are produced on that first postnatal day, the twitter and trill calls, and then we have calls that, so these calls basically disappear by 30 days, and then we have calls that actually transform. So we have a cry that may go to something like a phi cry or a subharmonic cry. These are just fancy labels for the same type of call, but eventually these will turn into the mature adult-like phi call. So there's two, so I just want to emphasize there's two things going on. You have these, they start off with this very complicated sequence of vocalizations. Some of those vocalizations are trills and twitters. Others are these noisy calls that over time are going to turn into adult-like calls. So some things are disappearing and some things are transforming. So if I were to say something is if I were to account for this change, what would you say is making this change happen? Anyone want to venture a guess? All the what? Okay, other marmosets. So he was mentioning, okay, if I ask the question, what accounts for the change? One possibility is, well, other marmosets are driving the change.
Yeah, community.
Community. Anybody else? Any other factors?
Critical periods in the brain.
Critical periods, so okay, a brain-based idea. Anybody else? Okay, those are two good possibilities. Let's see what happens, okay? So the standard hypothesis is that marmosets just learn to produce these in the right context. So learning implies, it could imply like a critical period or brain plasticity, and it could also additionally imply that, oh, that's getting some instruction. And then, so that would be for disappearing calls. So they're just saying, I know how to produce these calls, but now I need to learn how to not produce them when I'm alone and produce them when I'm in the correct context. Let's say it's around food or something like that. And then for this type of transformation where you have a noisy call that turns into this nice sounding adult call, most people would say, oh, this is just a growth-related phenomenon, right? The marmoset just gets bigger and is able to control its vocalizations better. Okay, so now let's focus. We're going to try to explain both of these things, and let's just focus on this side first. How do those calls disappear? And I'm going to introduce something that I'm very fond of in the robotics literature. I'm not an expert in robotics at all, but sometimes I read things on robotics. And in this particular case, a concept emerged from a particular line of robot science, which is called morphological computation. Okay? And morphological computation is this idea to solve a particular problem. I think the early roboticists, what they wanted to do is that, look, they're going to say they're going to have a very rigid robot, you know, the kind of like an R2-D2 type, let's think of it, C-3PO type of robot, okay, which has like a structure and everything's kind of rigid. And what you would have to do if you were a robot using something, a roboticist using that form, is that every time, for example, that it would have to take a step, you would have to program, oh, here's the height of the step, I need to lift this leg high, I need to drop the leg. You needed to program every single element that the robot had to, every behavior that the robot had to do. And that became like an impossible task. And then what happened is people said, oh, well, let's look at, instead of focusing, again, that's focusing on the controller aspect. The body's rigid and the CPU is just controlling all these things, and you have to program it. Another set of roboticists, I think of it as being led by this roboticist named Rodney Brooks at MIT. He's saying maybe we should look more, we should pay attention more to the morphology of the robot instead of just the CPU of the robot. And what he was kind of emphasizing is that if you make the body of particular materials, then, like, for example, if you have legs that have kind of like a rubber band joints and stuff like that, that could take a certain type of impact, then you could create almost mindless robots that could step all the way down these steps without having any kind of CPU control. The idea was to use the materials of the body to take away necessary computations from the brain, and they call that morphological computation. And so I wanted to take this concept and apply it to these developmental phenomenon. And in particular, I wanted to say, well, maybe those calls that are disappearing in marmoset vocal development, they're disappearing not because of necessarily any brain changes, but because their body is changing, okay? And where did I get this crazy idea from? Okay, I got this crazy idea from this amazing researcher, the late Esther Thieland, and she was trying to understand a very peculiar problem in human infants. In human infants, when they're born, if the healthy human infants, you put them on their back, when they're born, they'll start kicking their legs in like a step-like movement, okay? After about 2 months of age, they stop doing the step-like movement. And so here was a puzzle. The puzzle was, well, what's going on? Why do they have this kind of adaptive movement early on, and then it just disappears? And at the time where she was kind of asking this question, everyone else was saying, oh, well, this is, the inhibitory circuits of the brain are developing and they're temporarily inhibiting the stepping action. And then once those circuits get refined, then the stepping action comes back. So there's this everything was brain oriented. And what she did is kind of clever. She said, well, maybe it has nothing to do with changes in the brain necessarily or solely changes in the brain. Maybe just the physical nature of the baby has changed. So what happens over day 1 of a healthy baby to 2 months of age? The babies get fat. Okay? So her idea was like, okay, well, maybe the babies, they just don't have the muscular control. They don't have enough muscle to actually make their fat legs move in the way that they were able before. And so what is a way that she could test that? Well, what she did is she would take these fat babies that couldn't move their legs when they were on their backs or when you stood them up, and she submerged them, not all the way, up to their waist. She would submerge them in water, which would basically help buoy them up. And what she found was when you did that, the stepping returned, okay? So you take a baby like this with these fat legs, and it can't really do any of those spontaneous leg movements, and of course you're holding it up a little bit to facilitate that. You take that same baby and you submerge those legs in water, and the stepping returns. So here's an example of what I would consider a hint of like what would be called morphological computation. No change in the brain was necessary for this behavior to return. Okay, so now back to the marmosets. Now we want to say, okay, well, what about those disappearing calls? How in the hell can I relate that to this? Okay? So Yixi Zhang, basically from her prior work, knew that respiration, patterns of respiration and arousal levels, energy levels of the infants would drive those infant vocalizations up and down, and when they were driven to a certain degree, they would produce one type of call, and when they were driven to another degree, they would produce another type of call. So she knew that respiration was really an important factor for producing different call types, okay? So again, the question is, why do these calls disappear? And now we're asking, well, does respiration have anything to do with it? So her idea was to ask the question, well, maybe independent of any changes in the brain, you could have changes in lung size, okay? As your lungs get bigger, the respiration, of course, has to slow down because it takes longer to fill those lungs in, and your power to produce vocalizations goes up. And so she basically built a model that had a respiratory central pattern generator, a laryngeal pattern generator, and it was modulated by a dampening feedback from the lungs. And she just simulated increasing lung size by increasing the damping power of that feedback. And this is, yeah. I can summarize it. Basically, Manuel is asking, well, isn't this generally true that as you get bigger, you just need more and more oxygen to power your larger and larger body? I think that is true, and this is showing, what I hope to show is that independent of those energetic needs, it also has a way of changing the vocalizations. But let me present it, then see what you think. Okay, so she built this model, and then she paired it basically with a toy biomechanical model in order to generate actual sound output. And this model, I think next week with Ana Amador, you're going to be working in a workshop with this model, so you'll get more detailed information about that. But the bottom idea is that the bottom line is she could take this model and she could replicate the infant marmoset's vocal behavior. So P is kind of the output of the lungs. Here's the sound waveform. Here's this drive signal. To be honest, I actually forgot what K represents. But basically, her model is able to replicate the vocal output of an infant marmoset, where you have things like the trills and the twitters, and you have the cries, and then you have things that are like the contact call that's also known as the phi. So the idea is, can you use it? If I now change the feedback coming from lungs of different sizes, do I change the model's output in a way that matches the output of a real developing marmoset? And that's what's shown here. So let's just focus on this part. Now, if I look at the model, and here we have the damping coefficient here, so this is, you can just think of lung sizes increasing along this axis. You can see that the model is producing some levels of trills and twitters here, and those, as the lungs get bigger, those calls get produced less and less. They, in fact, disappear. And the pattern of their disappearance matches the pattern that we see in the real marmoset data for the disappearance of twitters and trills. So what the model is showing, at least potentially, is that maybe those calls disappear, not because of any kind of brain changes, although there probably are brain changes happening at the same time, but they could also just be accounted for by increasing lung size. Okay? So the question now is, here we have this model. It seems to capture this phenomenon. How do we actually test this model? What can we do that's the equivalent of putting the infant in a pool of water and simulating a lighter load? Okay? And the experiment that we did, which I think is kind of funny, but worked, is the following. So how can we simulate smaller lungs? Well, we can put the baby marmoset in lighter air. Okay? By doing that, they increase their respiration rate. So what we do is we test the marmoset on alternating days. We have them vocalize in an environment that has, it's a helium-oxygen mix, and then we have them also vocalize in just regular air. And the helium-oxygen mix is lighter air, so that's it's a way of simulating basically decreasing lung size or a smaller lung size over time. And so what you can see, this is data from one marmoset. So if we measure at P26, the normal marmoset at P26 is producing, it's almost a month, so now it's producing the normal contact calls that it would produce like an adult, right? They sound normal. If we put that animal in the same animal at the same age in the heliox environment, all of a sudden it produces those calls still, but now it's producing those other calls that had disappeared a long time ago. It's producing the trills and the twitter calls that had disappeared. In fact, this heliox seems to simulate what the marmoset was like 2 weeks earlier. So it's a way of almost reversing time by simulating the smaller lung sizes. And so well, we can just capture that with group averages, and we can see that in air, which is in the blue, this is the disappearance trajectory of the Twitter calls and of the trill calls. And then in heliox, and we can measure this because we're doing it every other day as the animal grows up, the Twitter takes longer to disappear than before. And then this is just capturing that in some bar graphs. Manuel? Yeah, so the question is, like, has anyone ever used, taken the balloon and like made their voice high? So the question, Manuel was asking the question, like, do the marmosets also show this shift in their spectral frequency? I think, if I recall correctly, if they show shift, it's a very, very small shift. And the reason for that is that works for humans because we have a long vocal tract. The space between our larynx and the cavity from when the sound actually comes out is big and shapes our vocal sounds. It's called vocal tract resonances. And the helium really works on that aspect of the speech acoustics, which marmosets don't have because they have a very small, short vocal tract. Just stretching? Okay, so now, again, using the summary size, now we're talking about development, and we're showing how effectively context and the body can account for some developmental change, and we have not included anything that would require any kind of experience-dependent phenomenon, okay? Here I'll ask the organizers, we're at 1 hour. Do we want to take a break, or do we want to continue? How do we want to proceed?
The break is in half an hour, so you can continue.
Say that again?
Yeah, just continue.
Yeah, because it was 30 minutes for questions, so because we are
Okay.
together, it's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so now we're still focusing on development. We're still focusing on this emerging system, but now we want to ask, is there any kind of experience that's causing this thing? So now we go back to the other prong of vocal development for marmosets, which is the transformation. So you have those disappearing calls, and we could say at least partly they disappear because of the change in the body, the change in lungs. But now that doesn't account for the transformation of these noisy cry calls into the adult-sounding contact call known as the phi call, okay? The standard hypothesis, again, is just like as the animal grows, it just gets better control over its vocal capacities, and that no experience is necessary to generate those calls. All right. So, and this is where variability becomes super important. So Daniel basically decided to look and ask the question, well, I'm noticing in some animals that if we look across the postnatal days and we look at the number of cries they produce, which is this immature sounding calls, and the number of phis that they produce, it seems like in the early part of life they produce a lot of those cries and then they stop producing them. And in the early part, they don't produce the phi calls, but they produce phi calls in the later part. So there seems to be this kind of shift between producing cries and producing phis, and that shift seems to be sudden. And so we wanted to come up with some sort of measure of that shift, and we made this kind of index that we call the phi-cry ratio. And that's basically the time, when is it then that the marmosets shift from producing cries all the time to producing phis all the time. The 50% mark is here, so in this, we call this the zero crossing. So the zero crossing for this particular marmoset is a little after 20 days, and you can see that they're producing cries here, and then all of a sudden they just produce only phis. And if we look across the 10 marmoset infants that we were studying, the timing of that zero crossing day was highly variable, okay? So those individuals are marked in these red spots here. And so you can see that they vary from 10 10 to 15 days, all the way up to 45 days. So we're looking at this variability, and then we're asking, okay, well, how could this, what is accounting for this, what generates this variability? And so we had, I don't know exactly how we came up with this insight, given that the literature was so against this idea, but we said, okay, well, let's look to see if maybe parents, the community, have an influence. That is, the community, does the community shape the marmoset's brain in such a way that it can modify the vocal output of these infants? And so what we did is basically ask the question, so now we have these marmosets, the infant marmoset now is interacting with these parents every other day, and it didn't matter whether it was the father or the mother, although that's a whole separate story that's unpublished and that I won't talk about. But we can just ask the question, well, does the amount, if we pairing these, if the infant's here and then we have them experimentally, the mother's here, and we're just measuring their vocal exchanges in a controlled fashion, does simply the amount of parental responses, the amount of vocalizations that the mother marmoset produces have an influence on when the infant marmoset switches to producing cries to phi, the zero crossing day? Okay? Is everyone with me so far? Yes, maybe? Okay. And here we see there's basically no relationship between parents producing vocalizations and how quickly the marmosets learn how to produce the contact call. But now, instead of looking at just mere exposure of contact calls, we ask the question, well, what if we only count the calls that parents produce when they hear a marmoset produce a call? So now we're creating a contingent, like a learning-like relationship between the infant and the parent. The infant produces a call, the mother or father responds within 5 to 10 seconds, and we say, well, that's now a contingent response. And we ask the question, okay, does the number of contingent responses that a parent provides the infant influence that infant's vocal development? And here we have a very powerful effect. So the number of contingent parental responses is on this axis, the proportion, and then the zero crossing day is on this axis. And you can see that there's a very strong relationship. The more contingent responses the infant gets from its parents, then the quicker it reaches its zero crossing day. So here's an infant that had lots and lots of contingent responses, and it starts producing those mature vocalizations at postnatal day 10. Here's an infant that has fewer contingent responses from its parents, and it takes much longer. There's an outlier here, and I can assure you that that outlier doesn't affect the main pattern of results. Okay? So we have a correlation. The correlation is showing us, okay, well, there's something about the parents responding and when they respond to upon hearing a vocalization that allows the infant to learn more quickly how to produce a call. Now, you may be saying, okay, well, this is a correlation. Maybe parents call more to healthier infants. Maybe there's all sorts of other explanations besides this learning-like explanation that I'm providing. So how do we address that? Well, we can, excuse me, we can exploit the fact that marmosets produce dizygotic twins. Okay, so these are twins that aren't genetically identical. Almost always it's a male-female twin, or frequently it's a male-female twin. And so we can do an experiment now. We have the hypothesis that they're learning how to produce their vocalizations from contingent responses from their parents. So now we can take 3 sets of twins, and we can have we put them in that experimental setup where they're in a room with another marmoset, except now the other marmoset is not real. We're just doing a computer simulation. We're playing the vocalizations of a parent through a speaker. And the speaker is triggered by the infant producing a sound, okay? And so what we do is we take one infant and we put it in that setup every other day for a few minutes a day. I think it was like 10 to 15 minutes. And we pair it with a mom that's either a really high responder, so every vocalization that the infant produces, the speaker is going to produce an adult feed call, and with a low responder, so only 10% of the times an infant produces a vocalization will the speaker output something, okay? And since we're doing with twins, we can control for other extraneous factors that people would say, oh, no, it's because of this or it's because of that. It's really, but after we're done with the experiment, then both twins just go back with their family, and for most of the day, they're just in their normal conditions. Okay, so again, the experiment, the infant's here. We do an experiment where, again, there's a visual occluder, so the infant does not know that this is a speaker. The infant thinks it's its mother or its father, and we're playing back sounds that are triggered by the infant's vocalization. And the two conditions are you have a high playback response at 100%, and you have a low playback response. And one of the twins is getting the low playback, and one of the twins is getting the high playback, and we do that for 3 sets of twins. And then what we do is we measure a variety of things. We can measure duration, dominant frequency. We can measure the amplitude modulation of the call. And here's what we find. A really, really robust result. So let's just look. It doesn't matter which one you're looking at, but let's look at the noisiness of the call. So the cries, the very first calls, are very noisy. They have a high entropy. And then eventually, when they produce adult-sounding calls, they have a low entropy, or they sound very tonal. Okay? If we take all the infants and we compare the low contingency infant with its twin that's in the high contingency response, you see the high contingency twin quickly learns to make its calls adult-like, whereas its twin takes a lot longer. Okay? You can do the same thing for amplitude modulation, and you can look for break down each twin set and show that the pattern still holds. So this is experimentally showing what everyone else thought was never going to be true for a non-human primate, which is they are learning how to produce their vocalizations, and in fact, they're learning how to produce their vocalizations with the same social reinforcement method that we learn how to produce our vocalizations, through caregiver feedback. Manuel. The way I think about, so the question is, what does Wiener entropy measure? I simply think about it as it measures the noisiness of the call, and the higher the entropy, the more noisy the call is. Daniel, do you have a more specific definition for that?
Yeah, it's the ratio between, I think, the geometric mean over the arithmetic mean, or the vice versa. It's essentially how peaky is the power spectrum. So if it's broadband, it will be higher entropy, and yeah.
Okay, so now we come back to this summary slide, where now we have basically kind of, in a sense, completed the system. We have the communication system at the center of changes in the body, changes in context, and through that experience-dependent phenomenon, there must be changes also in the brain. So we've moved from real time, from that cooperative communication skill, to now developmental time, which is showing how those vocalizations, those contact calls that are used in those cooperative exchanges are now, how do they develop? Well, they develop through changes in the body are important, makes those calls disappear, and then caregiver feedback, the social relationships, the reinforcement changes how the cries transform into adult calls. So here was my natural stopping point. So why don't I stop here and then ask if there's any questions, and then we can take a break.
So yes, in the last slide you had with the final results here,
This slide or the next?
one before, yeah. So what happens in those instances where you get some positive correlation in the cases when you have low contingency?
So you're talking about
So I guess bottom left on
this?
the third plot and bottom right on the second plot.
Yeah, well, this is this is just the variability that's in there. It can't account for. It's not 100%, so we're not sure what happens. All the animals eventually get to the point where they're producing the normal feed call.
Okay. You showed two things that make those monkeys to start talking like his mother or his father, or produce the same sound. What is more for the physical features, and what is more for the response of his father or mother? What relates more with one thing and what with the other?
So if I understand the question correctly, I'm showing multiple things as they relate to vocal development. And the question is, well, which features are more related to the experience from mothers or fathers, and which is more related to things like the body? Is that correctly the question?
Yeah.
So what I tried to present is that when it comes to the calls that are being produced in the wrong context, which is the trills and the fees, they don't normally produce, an adult marmoset doesn't produce that call when it's by itself or communicating with somebody that's far away. That's a call for close contact. But the infants are doing it anyway, even though there's no marmosets around. So for that story, which is the calls disappearing, part of it seems to be that as the lungs grow, it's almost like a small sized lung, because it doesn't have enough power, just automatically produces those calls, because those calls don't require, they're not long distance calls, so they don't require lots of power to generate. Okay? So the story that I'm trying to present is as the lungs get bigger, as the animal gets bigger, those calls disappear by themselves without necessitating any kind of cognitive control. The other side of the story is different from those calls. There's another call. This is the contact call, which is the main call that we focus on, which is the call that they go back and forth with. That particular call starts off, and when the infant's young, as being very, very noisy, and then will transition in quite a sudden way to producing a call that's very clean sounding and sounds like an adult call. And we wanted to know, well, when that makes that quick transition, that the timing of that quick transition is very sudden and very variable across infants. And so we wanted to know, well, what could be influencing the timing of that transition? And our hypothesis was the vocalizations of their parents are providing feedback to account for that transition. And so for that call, the data suggests and their experiments suggest that the more feedback that they get from the parents, the faster will be that transition.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
You have more questions?
Is there a relationship between the transition of the cries to the calls and the individuals being more able to get food by their own? Or
Could you repeat the question?
yeah, if there's a relationship between the transition of these infants doing the cries to going these more call-like vocalizations, and basically the individual being able to get food by their own? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, in essence, the question is, what is the advantage of being able to produce a more mature sounding vocalization quicker than another infant? Is that basically it? So for that infant able to elicit more care or elicit more food, get more food, than an infant that's still producing the cry? That's a great question. And we were never able to account for, like, to say, well, what's the pure advantage of learning vocalizations earlier? There's some ideas that people have, which is that the more mature sounding your vocalizations are as an infant, the more interactions in general you'll get from your caregiver. That's true for humans as well. If a toddler is able to produce something that sounds more like speech, then the mother and the father will be more likely to interact with that infant. And the same might be true for the marmosets, but we don't have a concrete biological advantage that's apparent. But it's a great question.
Cool. More questions? Yeah.
You've talked about two stereotyped kind of vocalizations, if I understood you correctly. And I was thinking, I'm a big fan of the work developed in Buenos Aires by Gabriel Mindi and Ana Amador. And I remember Gabriel telling me about this one experiment they did in which they took juvenile birds and replaced the tutor with the artificial song producer, in which they could distort the syllables continuously so that it almost sounded not much like the original sound of that species.
Yeah.
And the juveniles could learn it nonetheless up to spring. And then hormones kicked in and they switched to the regular song. I was wondering whether some kind of thing would be possible for the marmosets. Could the juveniles learn something that's not exactly like what their parents were producing? But would that experiment make sense? That's my question.
Let me recap. So the question is about the following. It's getting back to the songbirds. You can take the way songbirds learn is very plastic. So plastic that you can take, instead of the song that they would normally learn from their father, you could take a different version of the song or a distorted version of that song and play it to the infant bird, and that bird will start learning the distorted version of the song. And so the question is, to what degree do marmosets also have that type of vocal plasticity, and to what degree is that plasticity like a critical period where you have to do it within a certain amount of time, and then some biological factor, maybe it's hormones, maybe it's something else, takes over, and then they can't change their vocalizations at all. All right, so let me answer the first part first, which is how plastic are marmoset vocalizations? So we were never able to do that experiment. I think my best guess is, and I wonder what Daniel's best guess is, my best guess is that they're probably much more limited in what they can produce than a songbird. And I don't really have any, that's my best guess, mainly because their vocalizations are so tied to other physiological systems that, unlike the songbird, which has a dedicated system for producing and learning vocalizations, marmosets don't seem to have anything like that. With that said, marmosets definitely have, and this is the answer to your second question, definitely retain lots of vocal plasticity into adulthood. And there's two lines of evidence. One line of evidence is marmosets will learn dialects of their social group. So if you take a marmoset or a group of marmosets and you put them next to another group of marmosets, the new marmosets will start learning to produce their vocalizations to sound more like the neighboring group. It's almost like kind of a membership card. So they retain that kind of plasticity. And then the work that I haven't published that we're analyzing has to do with, well, do parents change their vocalizations when they interact with their infants? So just to give you some background, when you were a young infant and your parents were talking to you, they didn't talk to you in like an adult-sounding voice. They would make their voice sound all cute and all flowy and stuff like that, which is, in English at least, it's called motherese. And so the question is, if I'm saying marmosets are teaching their infants, so to speak, their infants, how to produce vocalizations. Do they change their own vocalizations in order to facilitate that? And the data that we have suggests that fathers will change their vocalizations quite a bit, almost sounding like a juvenile monkey, and mothers don't change their vocalizations. So the fact that fathers change it so radically suggests that independent of any kind of hormonal regulation, although there could be like a lower testosterone when you become a parent, they do retain quite a bit of plasticity.
Any more questions?
Hi. I want to know about the first three assumptions that you showed at the first.
You want
at
the
beginning.
answers?
No, I mean, one of them is that you have a body that is like an empty box,
Yeah.
that is just dominated by the brain
Mm-hmm.
in the communication job or work. But you have showed that that is not the case. For instance, in the long model that you made, that you have a morphological change that affects the communication. Then I don't understand why we saw those three assumptions.
So, yeah, so I get the question. So the question is, since everything I showed defied those assumptions, why present the assumptions? So I presented the assumptions as a way to kind of motivate my thinking, your thinking about what people think before all these data. Right? So before any of these experiments are done, people would say, oh, really, the brain is the controller of the body. It doesn't go the other direction. Before any of this work was done, people would say there's no experience-dependent plasticity in monkey vocalization. And before any of this work was done, people would say, you can't have something as sophisticated as what we're doing right now without having a big brain. And the work, so I set it up as like, okay, well, here are my assumptions, and then I'm going to say that they're all wrong. That's why I presented the assumptions. Is that what you meant, or did you mean something different? Okay.
Any more questions? Cool. So
I have actually.
Yeah. Why are you asking that?
So, do you think that is there any example where actually the body changes and that drives the change in the brain, kind of thing?
I don't have, not from marmosets, but I do have one of my favorite examples, which is if you look in there's people did a study of the ferret auditory cortex. So the ferret is a small carnivore. Do you guys know what a ferret is?
Yeah, Manuel presented it yesterday.
What was that?
Manuel showed it yesterday.
Okay, so you know what a ferret is. So there's work in auditory cortex in the ferret that they're trying to measure, well, in auditory cortex, how tuned are the neurons to space? So can the neuron distinguish between a sound coming from here versus here versus here versus here? And what they show is that the tuning is in the young ferret, the tuning is very poor. And what they did then is they basically simulated the auditory inputs to the young ferret. They simulated as though it had adult ears. And so everything's the same, except now the sound coming in there is like it's coming from adult ears. And when they did that, the tuning sharpened. So that's kind of the main example that I can think of, that here's a physical change is changing the brain in that direction. Manuel. So the question is, well, how do these changes align with brain development of marmoset? And I will touch on that in the next lecture.
I think that's a good point to take the break. Thank you, Asif, and see you all at 10:45.
Okay.
Thank you, Asif.
Thank you.